How much does it cost to live in Cuba? We asked ourselves this question a year ago.
The result: a Cuban needed the absurd sum of 82 minimum wages just to get by for a month. But today, a year later, I think most of us agree that the situation has gotten worse.
But are we exaggerating? Is it really more expensive to live in Cuba? And if so, how much more expensive?
Well, to answer this, we're going to look at exactly the same 10 expenses we examined a year ago. We'll see how prices have changed, and of course, we'll calculate the total cost of living in Cuba in 2026.
The first thing you need to know is that, over the past year, the Cuban peso has continued to lose value. The exchange rate has gone from $1 being worth 360 Cuban pesos to 520 Cuban pesos today. For its part, the minimum wage is 2,100 Cuban pesos per month, while the average wage is 6,830 Cuban pesos.
This amounts to $4 and $13, respectively.
Keep in mind, that's per month.
Although it's not uncommon for a Cuban to earn 10,000, 15,000, or 20,000 Cuban pesos, that is, between $20 and $40, but I'll tell you right now that none of these figures is enough. And the best example of this is our first expense, food. It's no wonder it's our biggest struggle.
Of course, the cheapest option is to buy the ingredients and prepare the meals yourself. So on the screen, I'm showing you the quantities for a month and the individual prices for each item. To keep the video from getting too long, if you want to see the details, you can pause the video for a moment. Otherwise, don't worry, I'll summarize it for you. For a month's worth of groceries, we would spend 11,640 Cuban pesos on grains and flour, that is, $22. The biggest expenses here are rice and bread. Meat, meanwhile, would cost over 31,000 Cuban pesos. Dairy products, on the other hand, would cost a significant 10,800 pesos. Vegetables, fruits, and greens would come to 9,760 pesos. In addition, we have other products, such as oil, coffee, salt, and sugar, which total 5,650 Cuban pesos. So the total food expenditure is 69,290 Cuban pesos, or $133. And let me clarify, I'm not talking about what a Cuban actually spends, but rather what they should spend, because it's obvious that most of us can't afford it. The second expense we'll look at is housing. In Cuba, most people live in the family home, and their only financial concerns are repairs and maintenance. Which, for many, is no small matter, since you already know the state of Havana's infrastructure. However, many of us don't have that option. Whether it's because the house is in poor condition and we can't afford repairs, because several generations of our family have been living in a small house, or simply because we moved in search of better opportunities. So, we either buy or rent. Buying a house is practically impossible for most Cubans. Although there are properties available for as little as $3,000, the minimum price for a decent apartment in downtown Havana is around $8,000, which is more than 4 million Cuban pesos. And all this money must be paid in a lump sum at the time of purchase, since there is no option to pay in installments. So the only option left is to rent. For a downtown apartment with basic amenities, prices range from $150 to $300. With patience, you can even find a deal for $100 a month, which at the current exchange rate would be 52,000 Cuban pesos. The third expense is one where we felt the impact the most in recent months. Of course, I'm talking about transportation. Public transportation is very cheap, only 2 pesos per trip, which is less than 1 cent in US dollars. Making 2 trips a day, 24 days a month, we would spend 96 Cuban pesos, or 20 cents in US dollars, per month. But, if we had to rule it out last year, this year, with the fuel shortage having intensified, it certainly won't be an option. Buying a vehicle isn't an option either.
An old car can cost around $5,000, and a new one, at a minimum, $22,000. Even electric mopeds cost over $1,600, so despite becoming increasingly popular, they remain out of reach for most Cubans.
For the rest, it's impossible to come up with that kind of money. So, once again, being practical, we have to take the boteros or almendrones.
They follow set routes,
with fares ranging from 200 to 1,000 pesos.
And many people have to take 2 or 3 to get there, and the same to get back. But anyway, let's not overcomplicate things.
Let's assume a person makes one round trip, each leg costing 500 pesos, so they would have a daily expense of 1,000 pesos, and a monthly expense of 24,000 pesos or $46.
This will be our reference expense for transportation for 1 month. Moving on to expenses, it's time to look at basic services. Here we'll be looking at water, gas, electricity, and telephone. Water and manufactured gas, or street gas, are quite cheap. For one person's consumption, the cost is 7 and 40 Cuban pesos, respectively. The downside, in the case of water, is that days can go by without a supply. And regarding gas, I should specify that I'm talking about street gas, because if you use liquefied gas or canister gas, it's currently impossible to get. So many Cubans are forced to cook with charcoal or firewood. As for electricity, I went from paying an average of 1,300 cup a month a year ago to paying 600 Cuban pesos. This decrease is due to the fact that power outages are lasting longer longer and longer. This creates a need for an alternative way to generate or store energy. The least expensive option is to have a portable power station, which costs around $670 in Cuba. This is a one-time payment, but to spread out the cost, we'll divide it over a year, amounting to 29,035 Cuban pesos per month, just to have a little more electricity. So, the monthly electricity expense would come to 29,635 Cuban pesos, or $57. Finally, the phone. Shortly after uploading last year's video, Itexa limited the purchase of credit in local currency and significantly increased the price of mobile data. So, while using 25 gigabytes used to cost 1,750 pesos, today the cost is 15,560 cup or $30. There are slightly cheaper options, but they have to be purchased from abroad. In short, monthly spending on basic services rose from 3,100 pesos in 2025 to 45,242 Cuban pesos in 2026, or $87. Next up are hygiene and cleaning products for personal and household use: soap, toothpaste, shampoo, and detergent. This expense, though it may seem small, is equivalent to a professional's monthly salary. We're talking about 6,645 Cuban pesos, or $13. The following expenses vary from month to month. So, to establish a fixed figure, it's best to consider the annual cost and divide it by 12 months. Let's start with clothing, for which we'll have to spend 113,350 Cuban pesos, or $218 in a year. Here are the individual prices, so you know if you want to splurge. But anyway, for 1 month, this would amount to 9,445 pesos or $18. The next expense is healthcare. The issue of healthcare in Cuba is complicated, since technically you don't pay for it directly, but most of the time, they don't have what you need. So, you have to find a solution on the black market. Let's say a person gets sick twice a year, has high blood pressure, and wears glasses. They'll spend a total of 39,440 Cuban pesos over the year, which works out to 3,285 Cuban pesos or $6 per month. If you need more specific treatments, it can get much more expensive, or you might not even be able to get them at all. But anyway, let's move on to a happier topic: gifts and celebrations. Because, of course, there are birthdays, Mother's Day, Valentine's Day, and Christmas. So, over the course of a year, I have to buy at least 13 gifts or contribute to celebrations. If I spend just $5 on each occasion, that would come to a total of $65. That amounts to a monthly expense on gifts and celebrations of $5.40, or, in other words, 2,810 Cuban pesos. Although it's the cheapest expense, is still more than the minimum wage. Let's move on to the expense that almost no one thinks about until something breaks: furniture, appliances, and electronics. Here I took into account the furniture and appliances typically found in a home, to which I added a cell phone and a laptop, which are essential nowadays. And yes, although they all last for years, they aren't eternal, so sooner or later they have to be replaced. Let's assume we already have all this equipment, but we need to save for when its useful life ends. For example, in the case of a cell phone, which costs $220 in Cuba, if we assume it will last us 3 years, which is 36 months, to buy another one at the same price when this one breaks, we must save $6 or 3,170 cup every month. If we do the same for the entire list, we find that the monthly expense for furniture, appliances, and electronics is 10,880 Cuban pesos, or $21. The biggest expenses are the cell phone and the laptop, followed by the washing machine, the air conditioner, and the refrigerator. That is precisely why these items are missing from many Cuban homes, as they are the most expensive to buy or replace. And now, the expense everyone was waiting for. Nah, just kidding, it's the most boring expense, the one nobody cares about and everyone wants to avoid. But anyway, we have to cover it: taxes. I remind you that taxes depend on what you earn, so it's not the same expense for everyone. But to pay for everything we've seen so far, first, you'd have to earn that money. Even more, because we'd also have to pay 30,525 Cuban pesos as a social security contribution, plus 58,640 pesos as personal income tax. In other words, in total, in taxes, before covering all the expenses we've seen so far, we must pay 89,165 Cuban pesos, or $171. And now, before determining the total amount we'll need to live in Cuba in 2026, let's look at the most notable changes over the past year. In Cuban pesos, all expenses increased by between 17% and 100%, with the exception of basic services, which increased by more than 1,300%. However, due to inflation, those same expenses in dollars saw a much smaller increase. On the contrary, decreased. While they went from this order to this one. But now, how much does it cost to live in Cuba in 2026? Well, taking into account the needs and expenses seen so far, to live in Cuba, you need a total income of 312,760 Cuban pesos, or its equivalent in dollars, that is, $601. That is nothing more and nothing less than 149 minimum wages. Of course, this was specific to our situation, but it could be worse or better. For example, a person in our same situation, caring for a child and an elderly person, would need about $885 to cover the needs of all three. Meanwhile, a single person in excellent health with their own home in an area unaffected by power outages and who doesn't need to use public transportation would only need about $319. Of course, any of these three figures is out of reach for the average Cuban salary. And we see this in the crumbling houses, in the cupboard that was once a refrigerator, in the meat that's never on the plate, in the child who doesn't drink milk. You can see it in our eyes. So, whatever our situation may be, we must, sadly, keep on surviving. If you made it this far and liked the video, don't forget to like it and subscribe. This is H for Hugo, and I hope to see you next time. Cheers, bye.